All right, good to see everybody. We are still using different backdrops now. Still at the Texas Military Forces Museum, where I am the director. What you see behind me is an F-84E Thunderjet. This was the first jet fighter bomber deployed by the U.S. military. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, it would be primary aircraft used by the United States Air Force during the Korean War, the type of aircraft flown by the Texas Air National Guard, which deployed en masse to fight the war in Korea. So a little bit of a different background, and in keeping with our subject matter today, which is the period as World War II ends through the 1950s. And this means that we're going to begin to untether ourselves from the book. In a way, the book tends to deal with, here's the Cold War, and that, we're going to take a more chronological approach. So the second half of the 1940s and the 1950s is our goal today. And as always, there will be 5 questions at the end of this lecture. Then we will have one more lecture that will deal with the 1960s. And there'll be 5 questions at the end of that, and that will be the end of the material that will be covered on the test, and in terms of the essay, in terms of the questions, and we'll probably have another lecture that I'll require you to read, but which we will not have graded test questions come from. I'll probably have you answer some questions for me just to prove that you listen to it, but that's the goal. We're coming down here to the end of the semester. So last time out, we finished World War II, but we want to back up a little bit to see what's going on politically, diplomatically, as World War II comes to an end. In early 1945, there had been a conference in Yalta, in the Crimea, where Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, had come together and begun to talk about what was going to happen in the post-war world. Churchill was very suspicious of Stalin. He believed that the Soviet Union had territorial ambitions after the war and would be a dangerous adversary. FDR, who was very, very ill at this point, didn't have a lot more time left to live, was a bit more trusting of Stalin, believing that he could work with Stalin. But when FDR died and Truman took over, that's going to change almost as soon as World War II is over. Winston Churchill gets voted out of office in England. He will come back later in the 50s, but for the time being, he's gone. So you have the end of World War II, you have the first use of atomic weapons, and you have the beginning of a falling out of the primary allies that had defeated Hitler, the British and the Americans, the French on one side and the Soviet Union on the other. And this is going to very quickly evolve into what is known as the Cold War. One of the agreements that was made at Yalta was that the 4 major allied powers, England, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union, would occupy Germany. They would divide it into zones, and they would divide the German capital of Berlin into zones as well. So Germany is divided up. And then at the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945, the U.S., England, and the Soviets agree on the occupation of formerly Nazi-controlled territory in Eastern Europe, and that the Soviets would get to occupy that territory, which of course they had overrun and taken from the Germans, and they were supposed to oversee the evolution of new governments in those zones. Of course, what nobody recognized at the time was that they were really drawing what would be the battle lines of the Cold War. So after the Japanese are defeated, and signed the surrender on the battleship Missouri, September 2nd, 1945. The U.S. and the Soviets agreed to jointly occupy the Korean Peninsula. If you think back, the Russians had an interest in Korea and China at the start of the Russo-Japanese War, is where the first fighting had taken place back in 1905. And so you have a split with the United States occupying the Korean Peninsula below the 38th parallel and the Soviets occupying it north of the 38th parallel. But with the end of World War II in the Pacific, France and England were busily going about to reoccupy the colonies that they had lost to the Axis powers. The British pretty much done that during the war, but for the French, their one colony that they had lost to the Japanese was Indochina, or what we know today as Vietnam. So in 1945, the French, the Dutch, and others begin to go back into Indonesia, Indochina, and to try to reassert their colonial dominion there. That's going to turn out to be very difficult to do for a number of reasons, one of which is that most of the indigenous peoples do not want them to come back. They had been brutally ruled by the Japanese. They were glad to be liberated, but they didn't want to exchange necessarily one master for another. That wasn't universal. There were classes of people in all these former colonies, of course, who had much to benefit from the return of the European powers and would welcome them, but they were probably not, by any stretch of the imagination, the majority of these people. And another, of course, critical thing had happened as a result of World War II, and that is that the myth of white European superiority that had been one of the touchstones that allowed relatively handfuls of European to govern millions and millions of indigenous peoples in these colonies. That myth of white European supremacy has been destroyed. After all, the Japanese were neither white nor European. They were an Asian power, and they had not only beaten the British in so many places and conquered so much British territory and Dutch territory and French territory and American territory in the beginning of the war, that had destroyed this idea that Asian peoples, people who were not white, could not stand up to white governments and to white colonial imperial powers. And so very quickly there's going to be a rising tide of resistance in places like Indochina. In 1946, the falling out between the U.S. and England on one side and the Soviet Union on the other was already beginning. In 1946, Winston Churchill, then a private citizen, had come to make a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, where he uttered the very famous phrase that an iron curtain was coming down on the border between East and West Germany, as he perceived, and quite correctly, that the Soviet Union had no intention of allowing free and fair elections to take place in the countries of Eastern Europe, in Czechoslovakia and Poland and Hungary and Estonia and Latvia and in these sorts of places that they had conquered from the Germans. The Soviets were determined never to be vulnerable to what had happened to them in World War II again. Stalin was going to create a buffer zone of friendly states from a purely military and strategic perspective. There is a lot of logic to that, but the difficulty here, of course, is that it's bound up in what very quickly became an ideological confrontation between East and West. The West representing capitalism and democracy, and the West and the Soviet Union representing communist totalitarianism and socialism. And so in the West, you believed in giving people lots of individual rights, people being able to make their own way in society, to innovate, to invent, to think what they want, say what they want, practice their religions as they wanted. In the Soviet system, none of that was true. The state would own the factories, the state would own the farms, the state would control everything in the society. It would brook no dissent. It would squash religion to the extent that it could. Those who resisted the will of the state or refused to speak the way that the state wanted to would be denied opportunity and privilege. They would be arrested, tried in courts where there was in fact no real due process, shipped off to work camps, the whole archipelago of them in Siberia, where they would be worked to death, where they would be tortured, write the wrong thing, say the wrong thing to the wrong people. You could be executed, killed, carried off, disappeared, this sort of stuff. People who fell into disfavor, even within Soviet hierarchy, could have that happen to them as well. And then they would literally go back and they would airbrush them out of photographs and film so that they literally disappeared from history. So it was a very brutal and very oppressive regime, but it had total control. There were all sorts of people who were willing to buy into that kind of a system, to accept it, embrace it, and work their way up in it. But it would lead to widespread poverty and disenchantment as opposed to what was going on in the West. And this kind of a system, of course, sows the seeds of its own eventual destruction. But at the moment, that destruction was very far off, because at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States were really the only two powers standing. England, of course, was still there, but it had basically bankrupted itself. It's pretty quickly going to lose its empire. Places like India are going to get their independence, and Britain's role in the world as its major power, its sort of arbiter of what would be allowed and not allowed, is going to fade, and it's going to be replaced in that role eventually by the United States. And although the Soviet Union was still very big, very strong, the U.S., of course, was in the dominant position. Our country had not been a battleground. It had been barely touched by the fighting. The casualties that it had taken, although they added up to almost 1 million, were very modest compared to what had been suffered by the Soviet Union and by Germany and by Japan. We had the world's only real industrial base left. We had abundant natural resources. We had an economy where there had been a lot of government spending during the war. A lot of people had gone off to work in the factories, and not just men, but large numbers of women as well, African Americans and others, had gone to the cities, had taken war work. This was a liberating experience socially for them. Women out of the home, working in factories and mills and shipyards for their first time. African Americans who had made a big migration out of the South into the northern cities during World War I, saw that reinforced during World War II. The other thing, of course, is that you'd had 1 million African American men serve in the U.S. Armed Forces, and when they went overseas, especially in Europe, they had not encountered the kind of legal segregation and the sort of Jim Crow mentality that existed, especially in the American South, and that was going to have a profound impact eventually, as we're going to see. So World War II had evoked a lot of changes, and those changes are going to be accentuated by the onset of the Cold War, because once we realized that the Soviets were not going to allow free and fair elections in the territory that they controlled, that they were going to create a buffer state. That combined with the fact that although the American military had demobilized pretty rapidly after World War II, the U.S. Army, for example, went from 12 million men in 1945 to 2 million men by 1947. The Soviets had done the same thing, but they had only shrank their military down to 3 million, so they were a large army still on the continent of Europe. The Europeans were very afraid that the U.S. after a few years of occupation of Germany, would go home, and that would leave Western Europe vulnerable to communist domination, maybe even communist invasion. And the only safeguard to that seemed to be atomic weapons. And for a time, the United States was the only country that possessed those. So atomic weapons was the counterbalance to Soviet conventional military power, and therefore it would become more and more to be relied upon as the method of keeping the Soviet Union in check. To deliver that weaponry, if necessary, in 1946, the Strategic Air Command, or SAC, as it is better known, was created along with an Air Defense Command within the U.S. Army Air Forces. That Air Defense Command was designed to protect the United States from any possible enemy bombers who might wish to across the ocean to try and strike the American homeland. So you're beginning to take moves of defense that are really centered around atomic weapons. Then the Soviet Union takes power in occupied Poland, or communists take power in Soviet-occupied Poland. You have another atomic bomb test in Bikini Atoll in the Pacific to see what an atomic bomb would do to a naval fleet. And that same year in French Indochina, a communist uprising begins against the return of the French colonialists. The communists were known as Viet Minh, and they attacked French colonial forces, started a war that would go on into the 1950s, and a war that eventually sucked the United States into it. The Americans had come to believe that the Soviets could not be trusted. That in fact their system was antithetical to Western democracy. Stalin, who was responsible for more mass murders and things like deliberate starvation in the Soviet Union than Hitler was ever responsible for in Nazi Germany and territory that Germany controlled, was the new Hitler. And the lesson from World War II, of course, is that aggression had to be confronted wherever it was found. You had to stand up to it immediately. You couldn't make the mistakes that England and France and the League of Nations had made. And so as the UN is created, this new version of the League of Nations, the idea is that it's going to have a Security Council, and on that Security Council you will have permanent members, Britain, France, the United States, the Soviet Union, and they would be responsible for deciding, you know, if the world would be called upon to send forces to fight under the UN banner to confront aggression. There was really a move here to try and keep another world war from happening, especially a world war in which atomic weapons would probably be used from the very beginning. But the idea of collective defense is going to fall short in the post-World War II world, just like it's going to fall short in the post-World War I world. So basically, you have this belief in England and France and the United States that the Soviet Union is intent on expansion. It's intent on exporting communist revolution wherever it could, especially into the third world. The third world, the underdeveloped, the poor parts of the world. We're talking the Middle East, we're talking Africa, we're talking Indonesia and places like this. There was a suspicion that a lot of the rebellions against British and French and Dutch colonial rule were communist inspired, or that communists were piggybacking on them and giving them the support. In March of 1946, a civil war began in Greece. Remember, Greece had been conquered by the Germans and the Italians in 1941. The British had gone into Greece to try and keep that from happening. They had been evicted, and then all throughout World War II, a very nasty guerrilla war had raged in the Balkans, in Yugoslavia, in Greece, and that sort of thing. And you had Some of those guerrilla groups that were backed by Russia and communist, and others, of course, were more Western-oriented and either were nationalist or monarchist or these sorts of things. So England was supporting the anti-communist forces in Greece. But they couldn't do it for very long because England was basically bankrupt as a result of World War II. And in February of 1947, it declared it was out of money. It could no longer assist the Greeks in their struggle against an insurgency that was believed to be backed by the Soviet Union. And at that point, prominent Americans, George Marshall, who had been the chief of staff of the United States Army and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during World War II and one of the architects of American victory, he had become a Secretary of State for President Truman. And as key aides, he had Dean Acheson, who was an Undersecretary of State, and George Kennan, who was an important foreign service officer, had been ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1933 through World War II, and he thoroughly distrusted the Soviets, as did Acheson, and they believed that the Soviets distrusted the Western democracies, the United States in particular, and that was accurate. The Soviets did. Stalin saw them as rivals, and so the idea came in that you had to stand up to the Soviets in the way that we had not stood up stood up to the Germans in the Second World War. So in early 1947, after the British said that they could not continue to support the Greek in their effort against a communist insurrection, President Truman declared that the United States would, quote, support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures, unquote. And so this is sort of the Truman doctrine. The United States is going to help countries that are trying to resist takeover through armed insurrection, takeover by communists for all intents and purposes. Of course, there's a lot of evidence that this is dangerous. The communists seized power in Soviet-occupied Hungary. Again, no free and fair elections. There was a fear that the devastated economic condition of Europe made it a prime target for a Soviet-inspired, Soviet-backed subversion that would bring communists to power in places like Belgium or France and that kind of thing. And the United States wanted to forestall that. We also wanted to help rebuild Europe to get it back on its feet so that it could militarily defend itself and it could be a bulwark against Soviet expansionism. And so the U.S. in 1947 announced something called the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was going to send enormous amounts of aid from the United States to help rebuild war-ravaged Europe and forestall the conditions that might lead the communists to gaining power in Western Europe. And ultimately, the U.S. would distribute $17 billion with a B, dollars in aid to the countries of Western Europe over the next 4 years. This was a measure that would definitely undercut what the Soviets were believed to be trying to do, and we begin to harden now into a military stalemate, a diplomatic stalemate, a scientific competition, and an intelligence competition between the Soviet Union and its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and the Western democracies led by the United States. This leads to a reorganization of the American peacetime military establishment. So we'd had a War Department, we'd had a Navy Department. We're not going to get rid of those, but now we're going to have a new National Security Act of 1947 that creates the Department of Defense, and under that will be the old Army Department, the old Navy Department. Now we're going to create the United States Air Force, as an independent branch of the armed forces. So during World War II, it had been the U.S. Army Air Forces, so the Air Force was part of the Army. Now the Air Force would be its own service. The Marines, of course, are part of the Navy. You would also create a National Security Council that would be an instrument to help the president deal with foreign military questions. You created the Central Intelligence Agency, which would be a continuation of wartime Office of Strategic Services, which had been in charge of spying and sabotage and espionage behind Axis lines. And you created a Joint Chiefs of Staff, where the Chief of the Army, the Chief of the Navy, the Chiefs of the Air Force, the Chief of the Marine Corps would all form a permanent body of people that would help the president run the military and give him advice and that sort of thing. And along, of course, with the creation of an independent Air Force, you also then have the creation of an Air National Guard. So you have an Army National Guard, which is ground forces, and now you'll have an Air National Guard, which will be air forces and fly the kind of jets like you see here behind me, at least early on. The Soviets continued to sort of prove the worst suspicions of the West. Communists seized power in Romania in 1947, and then 1948 they will seize power in Czechoslovakia as well. But it was in 1948 that the Soviets made their first really serious aggressive move against the West in an effort to try and get the British, the Americans, and the French to leave Berlin, which, remember, had been divided into 4 zones of occupation. But Berlin was 100 miles deep inside the Soviet occupation zone of Germany. The Soviets had gotten the eastern side of Germany, U.S., England, and France had got the western side of Germany, but Berlin geographically was located deep inside the Soviet zone in eastern Germany. And to try and force the Western powers out, the Soviets established a blockade of Western Berlin, the side that was occupied by England, France, and the United States. So they blocked road and rail traffic that would allow people and food and supplies of things like coal and clothing and these medicines and that kind of stuff to get into West Berlin. And the idea was that they were essentially going to starve the Western democracies out of Berlin. The Allies responded with the Berlin Airlift. It is one of the great first real confrontations of the Cold War, the blockade of West Berlin by the Soviets, and the response of the Western democracies was the Berlin Airlift. 132 U.S. planes, including 60 B-29 bombers now being used for peaceful purposes, would carry 2,500 to 7,500 tons of supplies to West Berlin a day. So if the Soviets wanted to stop that, they would have to shoot these planes down. And of course, if they shot these planes down, then that would be an act of war. You would be at the beginning of a third world war at a time when only the United States possessed atomic weapons, certainly something the Soviets did not want to do. So the Americans who had developed the world's only truly strategic air force during World War II now used it to undermine the Soviet act of aggression here. We simply flew over their roadblocks to deliver the food and the fuel. Some of it was parachuted in, some of it actually landed, or the planes landed and offloaded the supplies. So here we are, 1948, the people that we had been bombing 3 years earlier, we're now, with these very same aircraft, we are now flying to the rescue of, and American pilots and air crewmen would make little bundles of candy and chocolate and attach little parachutes to them and drop them out of the plane as they flew over West Berlin for the children of West Berlin, a memory that many who experienced that would never forget for the rest of their lives. And this eventually is going to succeed. It's going to force the Soviets to abandon their blockade and allow a land corridor to supply Western Berlin. So you have your first real confrontation here in Europe post-World War II between the Soviet Union, England, France, the United States. But of course, things are going on elsewhere around the world. In 1948, the nation of Israel declared its independence. This is a very complicated issue. You go back to World War I, when England and France had agreed to create a homeland for Jews in Palestine, sort of historic area of the Middle East where much of biblical history plays itself out. During World War II, this had been a refuge for Jews escaping the German Holocaust. They were turned away from a lot of other places, including the United States, before the war. And after the Holocaust, the Jewish people were determined that they were never going to let something like that happen to them again. They were not going to see 6 million of their fellows marched off to camps and slaughtered or worked to death or medically experimented upon and these sorts of things. And they would not rely on another country to defend them. They would have their own homeland. And so they declare their independence. 5 Arab states on their borders object to that, and they attack the newly proclaimed nation of Israel. And this is the start of the first Arab-Israeli war, and it was a war that the Israelis won. It's sort of the Israeli war for independence, and so they managed to establish their own country. Other countries are showing up elsewhere around the world. The U.S. and the Soviets both left the Korean Peninsula, and there were supposed to be elections to form a government in Korea that would unite the peninsula, but that wasn't going to happen. Neither side trusted the other, and so you had the creation of the Republic of South Korea in 1948 and the creation of the Korean People's Democratic Republic in North Korea, and the peninsula remained divided along the 38th parallel. The South Koreans, of course, propped up by the Western democracies, and the North Koreans backed up by not only the Soviet Union, but also the nation of China, because in China you had the civil war that had been going on all throughout World War II. It was kind of concurrent to World War II, and in the end, the communists had won the war in Korea, and so in 1949. You had a couple of things that are going to happen here that are going to, make this business on the Korean Peninsula a lot more dangerous. So in the wake of the Berlin crisis, the Berlin airlift, in 1949, the nations of Western Europe, the U.S. and Canada and Iceland came together to create something called NATO, N-A-T-O, NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this was a way to keep the United States involved in Europe. It was pledged to mutual defense. It would see the creation of a military force under NATO and an allied supreme command for all of the armies of Western Europe, as well as their navies and their air forces. And the goal was to defend Western Europe against potential Soviet invasion. And it was shortly after this that the creation of this that sort of showed the determination of the Western democracies that the Soviets abandoned their blockade of Berlin, which had lasted for 321 days. The U.S. and its allies at this point decided that they were done with the occupation of Germany as a defeated power. And although their military force would stay there now as part of NATO, the German Federal Republic, or what would be known as West Germany, is created as an independent country. And not long after that, the Soviet Union explodes its first atomic bomb They had developed it very quickly in the span of just 4 years, in espionage by Americans who were communist sympathizers and who passed secret information on to the Soviets regarding U.S. atomic weaponry was part of that. These people, at least some of them, were caught and they were tried and executed for espionage. But this helps to feed in the U.S. a real fear of communist subversion, communist revolutionaries in the U.S. It sort of harkens back to the Red Scare in the aftermath of World War I. In 1949, the Soviets not only explode their first atomic bomb, the communists win the Chinese Civil War, create the People's Republic of China, which is, of course, a communist dictatorship, as brutal as anything that Stalin was running in the Soviet Union. The defeated Chinese nationalists are forced to flee from mainland China to the island Formosa, where they create the country that we better known today as Taiwan. And of course, this is a sore point with the Chinese communists who wish to conquer Taiwan, but you have the danger here that any attempt to do that would provoke war with the Western democracies. So as we enter the 1950s, the old alliances that had helped to defeat the Axis powers in World War II are completely gone. There's now a confrontation between the forces of communist totalitarian on one side, Western democracies on the other. That competition will play itself out across the entire spectrum, not just military, intelligence, strategic and scientific, but also economies. We're having a great contest here. Which system is going to better care for its people? Which system is going to make them happier? Which system is going to provide for them? Which system is going to make them more prosperous than the other? The United States new National Security Council absolutely believed that the Soviets had a design for world domination, and they called for a U.S. military buildup, both nuclear and conventional warfighting capability. And again, the idea that we have to confront aggression wherever we see it. Now we're not going to make the same mistakes that had led to the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and the Japanese militarists in World War II. Means that we're going to be looking beyond our own borders at the rest of the world and coming to the assistance of anybody that we see under the threat of communism. And this is going to be complicated by the fact that a lot of the conflicts that were going on, the uprisings in former colonies and stuff, are a mix. Some of that is purely nationalistic desire to be independent, to throw off the colonial yoke. But some of the revolutionaries here are also committed Marxists. They're committed communists. So it sort of reminds you of the labor unrest, where you had laborers who were legitimately, trying to get better working conditions, better hours, better pays, but you had people who had political agendas and were advancing political ideologies that would sort of graft themselves onto these labor movements and manipulate them if they could, utilize them for their own purposes. The same thing is going to happen in some of these anti-colonial wars and revolutions that are going around the world. The U.S. certainly saw this in Indochina, where the French were fighting the Viet Minh, who were communist guerrillas backed up by the Soviet Union and the communist Chinese. And so in 1950, Truman announces U.S. military aid to Indochina. And this is followed very shortly thereafter in June of 1950 by a North Korean invasion of South Korea. This was a big shock. The North Koreans very quickly overran most of South Korea. It was the first pure act of aggression in the post-World War II world that involved crossing borders and armies and military action and fighting and this sort of stuff. The U.S. immediately began to support the South Koreans with airstrikes and cobbling together a task force of U.S. troops from the occupation forces in China to go to the aid the South Koreans. But we went to the UN Security Council and we said, hey, this is what the UN Security Council is for. This is an act of aggression, and the UN must stand up to it. One of the problems that you had in doing that is that each of the permanent members on the Security Council, England, France, the United States, the Soviet Union, all have a veto. But the Soviets were boycotting the Security Council over a relatively unimportant issue. They'd gotten in a huff and they'd walked out, so they weren't there to issue the veto. So the only time really in its history where it mattered, the UN Security Council recognizes an act of aggression and calls the nations of the UN to confront it. And so it's not necessarily going to be a U.S. War in Korea. It's going to be a United Nations war, and that's why President Truman referred to it as a police action instead of a war. Of course, it was a war, and everybody sort of understood that. We talk about it today as a Korean War, but for political purposes, for diplomatic purposes, you understand where the phrase police action comes from. That war looked like it was going to go very, very badly. The surprise attack of the North Koreans had allowed them to overrun most of South Korea. South Korean forces and the American reinforcements that were rushed in were holding on to a small corner on the southeast edge of the peninsula around the port of Pusan. So it was known as the Pusan perimeter. As the U.S. was mobilizing and other countries, ultimately more than 16 of them that would come to fight from England, from Australia, from Canada, from France, from the Philippines, and Greece and other countries are being organized. The U.S. is going to carry the weight here. We have the largest military, the largest Navy, the largest air forces. All those forces put under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, who's one of the brilliant generals who'd helped us win World War II against the Japanese. He had been in charge of the occupation and, if you will, the reconstruction of Japan, the turning of Japan from a empire under a monarchy to a democratic country in the model of the United States. And MacArthur decided not to just feed more forces into the Busan perimeter and try and fight his way back north. Instead, he went back to his old World War II strategy of island hopping, hitting the enemy where he least expected, and he staged a very daring amphibious attack on the west coast of the Korean Peninsula at the port of Incheon, one of the worst places in the world that you could imagine for an amphibious landing, incredibly high and low tides. It was a dangerous operation. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't even actually give MacArthur approval to do it. They just said that they acknowledged that this was his plan, but it succeeded brilliantly. It hit the North Koreans unexpectedly. It rolled ashore, cut across their lines of supply communication, led to the rout of their army, and so now the North Korean army was basically almost destroyed. It had to retreat into North Korea. UN forces followed, crossed the 38th parallel, began to overrun all of North Korea, which of course means that they're approaching the Yalu River, which is the border between newly communist China and North Korea. There were warnings issued by the Chinese not to come too close to the Yalu or they would intervene. Those warnings were basically ignored or discarded, and as a consequence, in November of 1950, the Chinese communists, through their armies across the Yalu, launched a counterattack against American and UN forces and drove them back below the 38th parallel. This led to a big confrontation between General MacArthur and President Truman, who basically, Truman had been reelected in 1948 to the surprise of everybody. He managed to hold the FDR coalition together, so he pulls off that rare stunt that Teddy Roosevelt had pulled off after the death of the elected president, and he comes to be president through that means. He runs for the office in his own right, manages to win it. Truman wanted to basically avoid having the war in Korea become World War III. MacArthur, who was a pure military man in most ways, wanted to use every weapon in the U.S. arsenal to secure complete victory. He wanted to use atomic weapons if necessary. He certainly wanted to bomb the bridges over the Yalu that the Chinese army was using to cross into the Korean Peninsula and using to supply the troops already there. He wanted to follow Chinese aircraft back across the Yalu so they'd fly into Korea, attack UN forces, and then when American or UN planes went after them, they would flee back across the river to bases in China. And MacArthur wanted to follow them, wanted to attack their bases militarily. This makes perfect sense, complete and perfect sense. But diplomatically, of course, it risked widening the war. And Truman said, if we widen the war with China, then we ultimately get war with the Soviets, who now have an atomic bomb, and this is not worth a nuclear war. And remember, the devastation of World War II is still very much in everybody's mind. Just 5 years ago that World War II had ended. And so MacArthur defied Truman and criticized his policies in public, and for that Truman fired MacArthur. That was a big scandal. There were people who thought Truman had done the right thing, people who believed that Truman had absolutely done the wrong thing. No substitute for victory, MacArthur had said, but Truman recognized that in a world armed with nuclear weapons, ultimate victory, the kind that you had won in World War II, was something that was probably not possible without devastating most of the planet. So MacArthur was fired. General Matthew Ridgway took over from MacArthur. He was a famous American parachute general during World War II. He managed to fight the war back to the 38th parallel, and there a stalemate ensued. You had something of a return to trench warfare. Neither side could gain much of an advantage. Peace talks began, and ultimately in 1953, there would be a cessation to the war. There would be an armistice, the creation of a militarized zone that still exists in 2020, and a division of the Korean Peninsula that would be a potential hotspot for the world through the rest of the 20th and on into the 20th century. All told, you had an enormous number of U.S. troops serve in Korea, 326, almost 327,000, alongside 602,000 South Korean troops, almost 1 million Allied troops altogether in Korea against 1,600,000 Communist troops, about 266,000 of them North Koreans, 1,350,000 Chinese, and some 26,000 Soviet troops. By the time that it was over, the U.S. had lost a lot of manpower, 36,000 dead, 103,000 wounded, 8,000 missing in action. The Allies alongside of us lost 178,000 men, 33,000 who've been killed. The communist casualties were at least 367,000 dead and 686,000 wounded. So it had been a very hard-fought war, a very bloody war, the first war in which both sides used jet aircraft. It was a war that had been started by communist aggression, had been defied by UN Security Council action, but it was a war that had been fought to a stalemate. And that was in many ways most unsatisfying for a lot of people, but it was the point at which the Cold War actually had turned hot. It had turned hot militarily, but it had been contained. And this idea of containment now was the strategy of the United States toward the Soviet Union, the Western democracies. We would contain the Soviet Union. We would hold them within their sphere of influence, and we would try and keep them from expanding around the rest of the world, conquering other countries and using those as bases to go on and conquering other countries still. All of this, by the way, is going to be happening at the dawn of an economic renaissance for the United States. And the 1950s is going to see vast changes domestically in the United States. America was, remember, the only country that was really untouched physically by World War II. Americans had earned lots and lots of money working in those defense plants during the war, but since the entire industrial base of the country was basically given over to military needs, there were very few consumer goods that were being produced, and so there wasn't much to buy. And so the end of the war found a lot of Americans with a lot of money in their pocket. It also found all those American servicemen coming home entitled to the benefits of the GI Bill. As a reward for their service. They could get cheap loans for housing. They could get government funding for college education and these sorts of things. In the pent-up desire for consumer goods, which American factories are now going to retool to start making, is going to coincide with the rise of electronics. We're going to get rid of the vacuum tubes and go to transistors. A newly revived automobile industry, appliance industry, and the invention of things like plastics and this kind of stuff to produce an economic renaissance for America that for a people who had endured the Great Depression is going to be mind-boggling and something, of course, that they're very anxious to have. The gross domestic product is going to grow at an annual rate of 3.2% throughout the entire 1950s. So the economy was super hot, and it is spurred in part not just by all of this domestic stuff, but by the enormous amount of spending that is going into the military as part of the Cold War. The development of new weapons, atomic weapons, new military technologies. The government is spending lots of money to do things. That's creating jobs. It's spurring economic activity, and it's going to lead to American widespread prosperity, and not certainly in every aspect of the economy, but it's going to be quite the contrast with what had happened in the 1930s. Of course, the Cold War confrontation here is going to see things continue to heat up. In 1952, the United States exploded the first hydrogen bomb at a test on Anahuac Atoll in the Central Pacific. This is a more powerful bomb, a much more powerful bomb than what you had used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In November of 1952, Dwight David Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Western Europe, the guy who had run the D-Day operation, the invasion of Normandy, he's elected to the presidency of the United States. Americans love to elect their war heroes. And this finally breaks the hold the Democrats have had on the presidency since the onset of the Great Depression. So FDR had been elected in 1932 and had won 4 terms. He died very early in his 4th term. Truman took over, then Truman won a term of his own. So basically, between 1932 and 1952, the Democratic Party controlled the presidency. Eisenhower is a Republican. He wins handily 442 electoral votes to 89 for his opponent, Democrat Adlai Stevenson. Ike got 6.5 million more popular votes than his Democratic opponent. And so the Republicans have the White House again. The next year, 1953, Joseph Stalin dies. This is, of course, not the end of communist dictatorship in Russia. That same year is when you finally got the armistice in Korea, but it also sees the Soviets explode their first hydrogen bombs. So the arm race between East and West continues apace. It's heating up. And that arm race is going to continue to spread over and over. And the new doctrine of containment, this Cold War, meant that the Western democracies, that meant the United States, were going to make some unsavory friends. Whether or not you were communist or anti-communist now sort of becomes the measure of whether or not you're going to be a friend of the United States or a friend of the Soviet Union. And as long as you were anti-communist, then you were going to find support from the West. As long as you were anti-capitalist, you were going to find support from the Soviet Union. And that means that both sides are going to cuddle up to some very unsavory characters. In 1953, the Shah of Iran, who was pro-Western, was overthrown in a pro-communist coup. The United States Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, helped to support, some would say instigate, a counter coup which would overthrow the communist rulers and restore the pro-Western Shah to power and make Iran a solid ally in the Middle East against Soviet expansionism in that part of the world. So if this sort of clandestine counter coup is going to give a victory to the Western forces in the Middle East, there was a defeat to Western forces in 1954 when the communist Viet Minh defeated the French in Indochina. They overran the French base at a place called Dien Bien Phu and wiped it out. It was a very big battle. The French had asked Eisenhower to deploy U.S. forces, give U.S. aid to help them out, and Eisenhower had refused to do that. And this leads to a French withdrawal from Vietnam, which is like the Korean Peninsula, divided between a pro-communist North and a pro-Western South along the 17th parallel this time. The difference, of course, and it's going to turn out to be a very big difference, is that Vietnam is not a peninsula. Although it's a coastal country, there are big landward nations to its west, Cambodia and Laos in particular, and then Thailand, which is going to mean a great deal, as we will see when we start talking about the 1960s. Once more, there was supposed to be elections to reunify Vietnam as a single country, but neither side believed the other guy would hold them honestly, and so the elections to reunite didn't happen. And so clearly you had suddenly a system set up again in Vietnam, like you had in Korea, with a communist North and a pro-Western South. And so things in Asia seem to be getting more dangerous in the same way that things in Western Europe and the Middle East are getting more dangerous. And the idea that you're going to have to, have alliances to forestall war if you can, and to fight wars if you must, begins to become more and more apparent. So in 1954, you had the creation of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, S-E-A-T-O, which is sort of the Pacific version of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization has Australia, England, France, Pakistan, the Philippines, Thailand, New Zealand, and the United States. And their goal is to confront communist aggression in Asia and the Pacific. So obviously this ideological confrontation between East and West, between democracy and communist totalitarianism, is now spreading around the world. In 1955, West Germany was allowed to join NATO. That was a bridge too far as the Soviet Union was concerned. One of the ways that the Soviets continued to justify their communist puppet governments in places like Poland and Hungary and whatnot was to say, hey, the Germans are going to come again, the Nazis are going to come again. And so when West Germany joined NATO, the Soviets responded by creating what is known as the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw, of course, is the capital of Poland. The Warsaw Pact is dominated by the Soviet Union, but it brings it into a military alliance with its Eastern European puppets, the Poles and ultimately the Czechs and the Hungarians and these sorts of things. All through this time, the development of atomic weapons is considering a pace. It's still the best and only way to deliver those weapons is by aircraft. So the U.S. has been very busily trying to develop a jet intercontinental bomber. That bomber, the B-52, enters service in 1955 and remarkably is still in service to this very day. In 1956, the Hungarians revolted against communist rule and asked the West to come to their aid. but the West refused to do so for fear that an intervention would start World War III. So we didn't help Hungary. The Soviet army came in and crushed the revolution. So this was the beginning of a kind of agreement, tacit though it may be, that the Soviets could do whatever they wanted within their sphere of influence, and there would not be an intervention by NATO. The Soviets, of course, were supposed to stay out of NATO territory as well. 1956, Eisenhower is elected to a second term, and he's overseeing a country that is prospering remarkably, and it's changing remarkably as well. What's going on here? Well, one of the things that's going on here is all of this prosperity is merging with a couple of things. All these servicemen came home. They were going to college on the GI Bill. They were getting jobs. They were starting families, getting married. This is all, of course, stuff that had been put off because of the war. They needed places to live and that sort of. So you had the birth of the suburbs. In the aftermath of World War II, prefabricated housing, sort of, kind of homes that looked a lot alike that could be built very quickly. Their components, pre-manufactured in factories, shipped to construction sites, put up very quickly. No real frills, things like basements and that kind of thing. But nice, comfortable, pleasant-looking suburban homes in neighborhoods outside of the cities. And people liked it. I mean, young families, veterans, their wives, 1, 2, 3 children, which was, of course, the norm at this point, could get one of these houses for $7,900, a lot more money then than it is now, but something that was within reach for a lot of people. And as a consequence of this, you have the birth of the suburbs. We have also the birth of a new consumer society. You have new kinds of stores that specialize in appliances, and Detroit is building more and more cars and selling those to the people. Is all within reach. Home ownership grows 20% between 1945 and 1960. By 1960, 1/3 of the American population is going to live in the suburbs. Now, that third was overwhelmingly white. 95% of whites are living in the suburbs in the 1950s. As the whites move out of the cities and into the suburbs, African Americans, Hispanics, Puerto Ricans are the people who take their places in the city. So this is sort of this consumer society is really going to end labor unrest. It's during this period that the industrial, or the Congress of Industrial Organizations, has always been more radical, is going to join with the American Federation of Labor to make the AFL-CIO. But there was so much prosperity now, and a lot of the things that labor unions had fought for and had won during the New Deal, 8-hour workday and these sorts of things, had ended a lot of the reasons for labor strife. Unions were well looked upon. They had the power to collectively bargain. Industry was willing to deal with them, and so labor unions would tell you, hey, workers don't really have anything to complain about. Things are good. There are plenty of jobs. Pay is good. Hours are decent. Conditions are better. There's all kinds of new technology, new consumer goods that people can afford to get. The marketing industry is at full swing, convincing the Americans that they want to be part of this new consumer society. And this is a society where there's sort of a lot of conformity that's kicking in. The 50s is kind of an era where we think of conformity, husband, wife, children, job at a factory, a job in an office, you commute back and forth, you go to the grocery store to buy your food, you go to the department store to get your clothes, you go to the store that sells appliances to get your refrigerator and your washer, you go to another store to get this newfangled thing called a television that is replacing the radio as a means of entertainment. More and more people are going to college. Consumerism, of course, means that you're kind of focusing on material things, but at the same time, people had kind of rediscovered religion. In 1960, 61% of Americans were regular attendees at church, and of course those were Roman Catholic or Protestant churches by and large. Women had entered the labor force in massive numbers during World War II and had left it in massive numbers when World War II was over, but they didn't leave it entirely. In 1940, 15.6% of women worked. In 1960, though, it's 31% of women at work, mostly clerical and sales jobs, not necessarily in the factories and the shipyards like they had been during World War II, but this was necessary for women to work because you needed more money for the family to have that suburban home, to have that car, to have the TV, the refrigerator, the appliances, to live this new, nice lifestyle. 1/3 of all of the entire labor force was made up of females in 1960. Women only made 60% of what a man did, but women at that point in many ways were doing very different kinds of work than men. But there is definitely a dichotomy that's going on here. And all of this invention of the suburbs and the suburban lifestyle, all that, put a heavy premium on the automobile. Of course, America is a very spread out country and much bigger than Europe. I mean, Western Europe basically is the size of Texas, if you want to get down to it. So the idea of a massive rail transportation net to move people from the suburbs to the cities really wasn't practical. And American troops who remembered well the Autobahn, which the system of concrete highways that had been built by Hitler in Germany, which we discovered when, of course, we defeated the Nazis, that was brought home. And in 1956, the Congress passed something called the National System of Defense Highways Act. And so we would begin to build an interstate highway system to connect city to city, to connect suburbs to city and to factories and these sorts of things. And it was sold as a defense measure to aid the rapid movement of people in the event of nuclear attack so that we could evacuate the cities. Somewhat an idealistic, naive view of the way that would work, but nonetheless, but also allow the rapid movement of military supplies and troops around the United States in wartime. In 1958, you had Congress pass something called the National Defense Education Act. Again, we're tying this to military defense. So it's the Cold War that's making these vast government expenditures possible. And what the National Defense Education Act wanted to do was to encourage the colleges to teach people science and math, so we'd have the brain power, as it was said, to compete with the Soviets in the Cold War, which is, of course, not just a war of military might and economic might, but it's also in many ways an intellectual war as well. And one of the things that this National Defense Act is going to, or Education Defense Act is going to do, is it's going to give grants and loans to people who want to go to college. And so, this, of course, is something that resonates with all of us here to this very day. And the importance of that had been spurred on in large part in October of 1957 when the Soviet Union launched the first man-made satellite into orbit. A little satellite, and all it did was travel around the world and emitted a beep, 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 beep. And it didn't stay up for all that long. But the Soviets had beat the United States into space, and the fear was that then, if they could do that, they could develop a means to deliver atomic weapons onto American soil. And so a space race begins. That is an offshoot of the arms race, which is an offshoot of the ideological confrontation, the economic confrontation that is the Cold War. Although the U.S. in 1957 sort of counters the Soviets, at least in a military perspective, by deploying the first operational intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, the first intercontinental ballistic missile. So now you could put an atomic bomb on a missile. These early ones were liquid fueled, and you could fire that missile from the United States, arch it over the Arctic Circle, and have it slam down into the Soviet Union. These first missiles were not terribly accurate, but they are nuclear tipped, so they don't have to be accurate. Precision is not necessary when you're carrying a bomb that could wipe out an entire city. In January of 1958, the U.S. managed to launch its first satellite, Explorer-1, into the atmosphere. That same year, Nikita Khrushchev became premier of the Soviet Union, and he would be a very bellicose leader, talking about how communism is going to bury the capitalism, and so he's verbally escalating the Cold War. Now that war is moving into space, it's going to lead in late 1958 to the creation of NASA. NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, is born out of the Cold War. And that Cold War is creeping closer and closer to the United States now, not just because satellites are flying over our country, not just because the Soviets, like the US, have atomic weapons, but also because communism is very near the US borders. There is a communist revolution in Cuba that overthrows the government there. Communist revolution is led by a man named Fidel Castro, who's going to become a client of the Soviet Union. And so 90 miles off the coast of Florida, you now have a communist country. And of course, this is going to make Americans very, very nervous. And so the 1950s was an era that saw America at home become a more prosperous country, the development of a consumer society, but the end of class in a lot of ways, the birth of a robust middle class that would embrace most Americans, but the continuation of racial divisions. It was primarily whites who enjoyed all the benefits, or most of the benefits, of this new consumer society, but the growth of education, and the importance of science as a result of the Cold War confrontation between East and West, a confrontation that is now touching not just Europe, but Asia, the Middle East as well. Not everybody was on board with the sort of conformity, the idea that the nuclear family, husband, wife, house in the suburbs, a handful of kids, that was the goal of life. This is the purpose. There's going to be, as there always is, to every great movement, there's going to be a counter to that, something of a backlash. If the U.S. had come out of World War II as the most powerful country on the planet, arguably the only superpower, we now had a rival. And that rival, the Soviet Union, had a potentially very powerful ally, communist China. And so alliances were beginning to pop up. Enormous amounts of money were being poured into the intellectual, the physical, the military, the economic aspects of the Cold War. That was going to have an economic benefit for the American people, the people of Western Europe, and the democracies for sure. It's going to begin fairly quickly to strain the resources of the communist totalitarian states, whose economies are not going to be able to keep pace. But this is going to do nothing to lessen the sharpness of the confrontation. It's not going to do nothing to prevent the backlash that's coming to the new consumer society born in the 1950s. It's all setting the stage for the 1960s to be one of the most dangerous, one of the most turbulent eras in American history. But we will save the 1960s for the next lecture. And so now your 5 questions. Your 5 questions, okay? Question number 1, what does NATO stand for? What does NATO stand for? NATO, what does that stand for? Question number 2, the first Republican to be elected to the presidency since the Great Depression. Who is the first Republican to be elected to the presidency since the Great Depression? Question number 3, the Soviets responded to the entry of West Germany into NATO by creating this military alliance. What is the name of the military alliance created by the Soviet Union after West Germany became part of NATO? Question number 4, what is the name of the law that leads to the government giving loans and grants to American children who wish to go to college? What is the name of the law that leads the U.S. government to giving grants and loans to American who wish to go to college? And lastly, question number 5, what is the name of the American general who basically saved South Korea from being destroyed with a brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon, but was then later fired by President Truman? What's the name of the American general who staged the brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon that saved South Korea, but then that general was later fired by President Truman? So those are your 5 questions. Next lecture of the 1960s and 5 more questions. That will give you all the questions that will be on the test, and we will go visit the 1960s when we get together next time out.